Hey friends, this episode of The Fellow on Call is not meant to be used for medical advice and is intended for educational purposes only. Patient information has been modified to ensure privacy. The views expressed in this episode do not necessarily reflect the views of our employers. Enjoy!
Welcome to another episode of The Fellow on Call, the Hem-Onc podcast. This time we're coming at you from Washington, D.C. at the American Society of Hematology headquarters. I'm Ronak.
And I'm Vivek.
And in today's episode, we have another one of our awesome collaboration episodes with the American Society of Hematology, as well as the ASH Trainee Council and their podcast, Hematopoiesis. This is as part of our ongoing episodes, helping our listeners with career development, this time focusing all on clinical research.
Yeah, really excited to get into this one. I have to say, so in this intro, Ronak showed up because he's lame and wanted to be a part of the episode, and Dan didn't come because who knows where Dan Houserath is. Nobody knows. Nobody knows where that guy is. This is a really great episode. We really get into the details of how do you start a career in research? What does that mean? We go through what should you do as a medical student, as a resident and a fellow. We decode this myth that you need to open up a clinical trial when you're a resident, or you need to finish that clinical trial as a fellow. We really talk about what it's like to in the day of the life of somebody who is actually a clinical trial academic investigator. I've still learned a lot from this. I am a faculty member. I do some of this stuff, but it's always good to hear somebody else's perspective. So really excited for everybody to listen to this one.
I'm equally excited to listen to this one since I wasn't able to be a part of this episode, but now this has cured my FOMO from being able to do the intro. So listeners, without further ado, let's roll that show.
Welcome to another episode of our joint series with the Hematology Trainee Council from ASH. Today we have Hanny Al-Samkari, who is a classical hematologist and clinical investigator at Massachusetts General Hospital, where he serves as the Peggy C. Blitz Endowed Chair in Hematology Oncology and an Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Hanny, thank you so much for joining our show.
It's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
So we always like to start off our episodes with a fun fact. So Hanny, tell us a fun fact about yourself.
Fun fact about myself. Well, I have to think about that. This is not such a fun fact, I guess. It's more of a nerdy fact. But I knew I wanted to be a hematologist from the time I started my second year Hem-Onc course in med school, because we took home microscopes and slide boxes. I just loved looking at the slides and trying to figure out what things were. The slides were probably, 30 years old, and they had old names for the diseases like ANLL for acute myeloid leukemia, acute non-lymphocytic leukemia. And I just thought it was really fun to be able to look at the slides and, I can make a diagnosis just like that. I'm a lifetime hematology nerd, I guess.
I like it. So my son, 10 and a half months old, his favorite stuffed animal right now is a red blood cell. So, you can start even earlier than that. You just never know.
I love it. He's on the right path.
So today, for our third episode of the Hematopoiesis, we're going to be talking about a topic that a lot of trainees might be less familiar with from medical school, which is clinical research. So the overall goal of our episode is to define what constitutes clinical research, what a career in clinical research as a hematologist might look like, and how trainees can start getting involved in clinical research early in their careers. So thank you very much, Dr. Al-Samkari, for joining us. To kick off our discussion, just to make sure that we are all on the same page, there's a wide spectrum of types of research that constitute clinical research. So can you kind of describe the type of studies that you've been involved in and what kind of falls under this topic?
Absolutely. So really, clinical research involves research centered around patients. To put it very simply, there are a lot of different ways that can materialize, right? So people, I think, first thing that comes to mind is clinical trials, right? And clinical trials is really what I focus on in my career and in my research focus as a clinical investigator. But there is a whole host of other patient-centered research that qualifies as clinical research. So you have clinical outcomes research, you have large database research, you have health services research, you have research that these various different types of clinical research can look at the cost of care. They can look at the most efficient way of delivering care. They can look at aspects of patient care and development of novel therapies and assessment of the current therapies we use in ways that clinical trials are just not able to, right? Because it's not feasible or ethical to do clinical trials in every single circumstance. The prospective clinical trials where we enroll patients and randomize, and then you have a lot of different additional fields of clinical research that are really essential to filling in all the gaps and ensuring that we are applying knowledge that has been accumulated in the best possible way.
And, I think that's the hardest thing when you're a trainee is just understanding this nebulous topic of clinical research. That was a good overview where we can kind of see this is very broad with clinical research. There's a lot of different avenues you can go down. One of the things, in preparation for this episode and talking to you, you're a clinical investigator. You do investigational trials, and that's a very, very interesting thing and really something that many trainees strive to achieve. One of the things that's a big black box for trainees, I feel like, is how do you get there, particularly starting out even at the residency level. So I think we should work our way up from residency to fellowship to junior faculty, just thinking about how you get to be a clinical investigator. Let's take you back to residency. And even when you take yourself back to residency, what are things that you wish you had done or things that you would recommend somebody to think about doing? Because it's not one of those things. You can't just say, hey, just go run a phase 3 clinical trial. That's not how this works. So walk us through that, and let's start with residency.
Fantastic question. Yeah, you can start with residency. You can also even go back to med school. I think the first thing you want to do when you are interested in clinical research is do clinical research. And one of the great things about clinical research is any med student can do it, any resident can do it. You just express interest to a mentor that is doing clinical research. And by the way, that mentor can be a fellow in the field that you're interested in. They don't even have to be an attending, but certainly an attending also works in this regard. And do a retrospective cohort study, right? Do something that introduces you to thinking about patient-focused research. A lot of medical students and residents have done bench research as undergraduate students. And so they have a good sense for what that looks like. As you said, it's very nebulous to what clinical trials or clinical research is, and it's extremely approachable. It just takes an interesting question, and that's not a question that you have to come up with, right? It's always great if you see questions while you're on the wards as a resident or as a medical student, and you wonder, has anyone looked into this? Is treatment A safe in X circumstance? Is treatment B better than treatment A? There are all sorts of questions that come up. What lab test X in patients with chronic kidney disease? How well does it work? There are lots of different, unlimited numbers of questions that can be asked. Most of those questions are already answered or are probably not feasible to assess in a small retrospective cohort study, but a lot of things are. And this is really where the mentorship comes in. And you're going to notice a theme. I'm going to sound probably like a broken record here. The importance of mentorship is, I think, critical in all aspects of research and in medicine in general, but really, really critical in clinical research. So for residents and medical students, I would say express interest to the attending that you're on service with, express interest to attendings or fellows who you have had a good relationship with and you've learned from, and just say, I'm really interested in doing research in X field. Obviously, hematology is the best field ever, so everyone should want to do research in hematology. But I'm interested in doing hematology research. I'm interested in doing a study related to leukemia. I'm interested in doing a study related to sickle cell disease, related to hemophilia, whatever it is. The person you're talking to is probably not the right person to lead you in that regard, but they can direct you to the right person if they're not the right person. They can make a warm introduction for you. And it's as simple as residents and med students are really busy, but you can finish one project over the course of your residency or what have you and take it to completion and publish it. The mentor can really help you get there. And once you've done that, you have your foot in the door, right? And so for fellows and residents who are really interested, as you pointed out, in clinical trials research, you can't just say, I'm a fellow, I'm a resident, I'm going to do a phase 3 clinical trial, right? Clinical trials cost a lot of money. They take a huge amount of time and a whole team and, require often getting grants from NIH or from pharmaceutical companies or what have you. But you can say, I would love to join the hematology research group for their weekly clinical trial meetings. And I'd love to contribute however I can. For the first so many months, that's just going to be coming to the meetings, seeing what's happening, seeing how the investigators run the studies, getting familiar with what a clinical protocol is. I think a great path, and not everybody has to take this path, right? But a great path is you do the retrospective study in something you're interested in. It ends up being fruitful. You then write a clinical protocol related to that study as a fellow. Ultimately, that goes through many iterations, but eventually evolves into something that, as a junior faculty, you can actually do that trial. And it might be a phase 1b proof of concept study, or it might be a pilot study, something small. But that's okay, because so long as it's something you're committed to, something that's novel and important, you can do it.
I think you really highlighted some key things that I see as I review fellowship applications too for residents who are interested in pursuing a career in clinical research. And one of those things is that you have to get your foot in the door and you have to follow through. And that's the mentors is so important. We had a prior episode in this partnership with the Trainee Council on how to choose the right mentor and what to look for in a good mentor. And it's really following through to one of those studies, knowing that, look, you don't have to run a clinical trial. It's not feasible to do that. It takes time, money, all the things that you talked about. As you get into fellowship, it's going to those meetings. It's really understanding what is it? What is it to run a clinical trial? What does that involve? And I think those are really, really important as people may decide, actually, clinical investigation and trials isn't my thing. Maybe I'm more interested in outcomes research or policy research. There's a lot of different avenues that people can go down. And starting out with those retrospective studies are key. It puts your foot in the door. It gets you exposed. It gets you an understanding of how to write, because medical writing is something that's important, and understanding how to do that. So I really think that's such good advice that you can give to somebody as they start to approach this.
Yeah. And what you mentioned about mentorship is so key, right? Because as a trainee, I found I wanted to do research in a field, like classical hematology, sickle cell, like you said, but I didn't know what questions to ask. I knew that I didn't have the volume of clinical experience I needed to generate those questions. And I feel like working with the mentor directly can be so valuable in that. And another thing is, I was never good at stats. I basically slept my way through college statistics. I don't think I even went to the final. We got to use the best 3 of our exams, and I did fine on the first 3. So I'm like, you know what, forget it. Do you recommend that trainees pursue some kind of formal training in clinical research? I think actions over words, right? Like you did formal training in clinical research. So I think we know where you come down on this. But why do you think that's important for people?
It's such a good point. And one of the things that scares people about clinical research is statistics. I'm comfortable with a lot of biomedical statistics, but right, for big clinical trials, right, a statistician is doing all of the nitty gritty there, right? That's not me. For a smaller retrospective review type study that requires rudimentary statistics, it is me that's doing that, right? A lot of the time, or my mentee, and I'm helping them do it, right? I do think that some formal training is a great idea. I think that a lot of universities in this day and age, there's so many things available online in terms of sort of free or essentially free biomedical statistics intro modules and things like this. It's not difficult to do one of these things, but also like a lot of residency programs and fellowship programs have clinical investigator toolbox kind of modules that you can do for 2 weeks or 3 weeks when you're not busy in the ICU or what have you. And they give you that kind of very basic introduction to statistics. And they take it the next step when you're a fellow or what have you. So yeah, I do think it's a good idea to do those sorts of things. Understanding statistics is very empowering. And ultimately, right, as a trainee, your mentor is going to be reviewing your statistics, making sure that what you're doing is correct. They, in many cases, have a statistician that they work with that they can, if something is beyond their knowledge of statistics, they can get the statistician to help. Absolutely. I do think that statistics is good to have. And to the other point, right, all of these skills are relevant irrespective of the type of clinical research that you are looking at, whether it's patient-focused clinical trials work, whether it's outcomes research, whether it's health services research, whether it's policy research. Statistics comes in to all these things, and having a comfort with working with patient and clinical data is critical either way. And these are all things that before you're totally differentiated and you know exactly what kind of clinical research you want to do, you can really get your feet wet as a trainee. And I strongly advise doing this. And one other thing that was brought up that I think is important to comment on, when you are working as a trainee, everybody's busy in medicine, no question about it. One of the best pieces of advice I can give to trainees is to follow through, right? It is to finish that thing that you started. And a good mentor will be there for you when you have trouble, when you need help, when something isn't working out the way that people expected, when you're looking through the patient charts and it turns out that you have to take a 90-degree turn in what the project is you're doing because you're not finding the data you need to find. All of these things happen. But when you have an opportunity to do something and to work with someone on something, do a great job of it, right? Even if there are other external challenges or other external issues, I think this is probably the best piece of advice, because recognizing, right, that we all recognize that trainees are new to this and that we need to spend a lot of time to get them to where they need to be. And that's what good mentors do. But one thing that's really important is to not phone it in, right? Do as good a job as you possibly can to really make that impression, because this is a small world. And, there are people that you'll be reaching back to, mentors from medical school and from residency and from fellowship, that you'll be connecting back with for future opportunities and for letters of recommendation and all of this moving forward into your career.
That's great advice. I know sometimes as a trainee, you have so much on your plate focused on learning your clinical content, doing well in rotations. And then, it's the extracurricular research stuff that sometimes slides off the to-do list.
It can fall by the wayside, right? Nothing is more important than taking care of patients and taking care of yourself. This is really kind of an extracurricular activity a little bit, but no good mentor is expecting you to be productive while you're on night float in the ICU. Okay, right? That's not realistic. I tell my mentees, listen, I'm here for you when you need me, but you have to be self-motivated, right? I'm not going to be knocking on the door every month to see where you are or how far along you are in your data review. You need to be doing it on your time, and we are aiming for submitting an abstract to ASH or whatever in 8 months. It's going to be up to you to ensure that you are working through and managing your time such that you do this. And if you find out that you can't, that's okay. Let me know. We can aim for the next time or whatever it is. But every mentor, I think, has a different style in that regard. But I think it's incumbent on the trainee, right, to take the wheels, so to speak, on that.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on something else you said earlier. A lot of times you come into med school with the idea of research being wet lab research. I got involved in a wet lab in high school, and to me, it wasn't research if you weren't wearing gloves and holding a pipette. You weren't descaling the water bath after hours. I like that you point out there's a lot of value in these retrospective studies. It feels like there are a lot of them coming out, but there was a retrospective, like a massive retrospective study. There was a plenary talk at ASH last year, right? They can be more than just hypothesis generating, but I think that's a huge role in clinical research, don't you think?
Absolutely. Most clinical research is retrospective. So much of what guides our practice, believe it or not, is observational research, which primarily is retrospective. It's hugely important. It is the basis on which all the prospective data, all the prospective studies are built on. So retrospective research that had been done by my mentees have described clinical entities, have characterized them, have made significant impact on the standard of care by investigating repurposing of certain drugs to treat other things, right? There are lots of things we do in hematology clinics that are interesting and different and involve rare diseases where there's never been a clinical trial or there may never be a clinical trial, right? There's so many opportunities just for someone with motivation, with some belly fire, who's going to put in some elbow grease to make a big impact with retrospective research that can be cited dozens or hundreds of times within a few years of it being published, research that really makes a big difference. So I tell my trainees, this is important work you're doing. this is novel, this is different, this is something that has not been investigated or not been well investigated before. This is really going to make an impact in patients' lives. And I think that's really, really important for people to understand. So yes, research is not just pipetting. It's not just wet lab stuff. You can make a big difference by looking through a few hundred charts, collecting the right data. You have a unique skill set. Not very few people can look through these charts the way you can look through them and think about the data the way you can think about it. And working with your mentor, write it up and do proper analyses that are very meaningful and that will guide docs in their day-to-day practice.
So I feel like you're touching a lot on what's so exciting about incorporating clinical research into your career. Getting a little bit into more of the nitty-gritty, what does your day-to-day look like compared to someone who maybe has more of a purely clinical practice?
I spend about 3/4 of my time doing clinical research, and that involves writing protocols, it involves writing manuscripts, it involves peer review, it involves writing grants, and it involves seeing patients on clinical trials, right? That is part of clinical research. When you're a clinical investigator doing clinical trials work, the patients I see on clinical trials are part of that 75% of my clinical research time. So I spend about 2 days a week in clinic where I'm seeing patients, primarily patients in clinical trials, patients that fall within my specific academic areas, recruiting patients onto the studies, seeing them for their study visits, right? Collecting their adverse events, adjudicating those adverse events as related or not related to the investigational drug, doing all of the protocol indicated efficacy assessments. These are all parts. It's sort of like seeing a patient in clinic, but with a whole additional layer of importance and complexity kind of layered onto it, which is fun, right? If this is the kind of work that you want to do. And then the other remaining 3 days out of my work week, I'm doing all the other things that I mentioned, right? As clinical investigators, you write a lot. You write grants, you write proposals, you write manuscripts, you revise manuscripts. And so there's a lot of work that goes into that. It was brought up, right? The importance of being able to medically write is obviously critical, and as being a researcher in any type of research in medicine. And this is a skill that you learn. And my first paper was not something that I would consider to be well written at all right now, right? And everybody's allowed to learn, and have your mentor is going to return something that looks almost completely different, like it's totally covered in red ink or in modern day, right, in track changes in Word. That's okay. You learn from that, you move on to the next one. That is how I spend a lot of my day-to-day. I do a lot of meetings with my co-investigators. We do investigator meetings. We try to determine if we have to update protocols, if we have to change things. Clinical trials are living, evolving beings in many ways. I participate in grant study sections where we're trying to objectively rate grants and determine who gets grants. I'm an editor for multiple peer-reviewed journals, so I receive manuscripts. I'm an associate editor for the American Journal of Hematology, the Journal of Thrombosis and Hemostasis. I receive manuscripts. I make decisions on whether manuscripts should get sent out for peer review or whether they should get invited for revisions or they should get rejected, so on and so forth. So a role that I think is really, really important in kind of being a gatekeeper for what ends up in well-respected medical journals, which is critically important for everybody in academic medicine. And I do a lot of lecturing. I do a lot of travel. I'm all over the place. And this is, I think, very common it is very common for clinical investigators. In the last few months, I have been to Stockholm. I've been to Paris. I've been to Osaka. I've been to multiple areas in the Middle East. I've been to Dubai. I traveled to Australia last year. I'm going to New Zealand this year. You get to travel because you're invited to give talks on your research and on your expertise, and also to go to conferences, right? You do a lot of meetings, not just, one meeting a year to learn all the new updates, but you go to lots of different meetings to hear about all the latest in your field in terms of research and to hopefully present some of your research as well. I think it's similar to someone who is primarily clinical, perhaps those 2 days a week, but the rest of the time it's quite different.
And I think that's a really important overview to say, as you embark on this journey to be a clinical investigator in the academic setting, what does that look like? And being a good administrator, being very organized, these are really, really important things. It's not just about being able to see patients, take good care of patients. That's a very critical, important thing. That's our number one goal, is to take care of patients. In addition to that, you have to like the administrative work. There is a real burden, if you will, and burden may not be the right word, but to some, it's a burden of administrative work. And to others, it's what you enjoy doing, and it's part of the game. It's how you are at the table to write the protocols. It's how you inundate yourself with all of the newest research as you're doing the peer review. It's really one of those things that's critically important to understand before you start that journey so that you don't burn yourself out, that you know what you're getting yourself into. And that's why going to these meetings, I think if we take a step back and think about, as we wrap up the episode right here, if you go to these meetings as a trainee, really understand what your mentor is doing on a day-to-day basis, make sure that's for you. Make sure that's really what you want to do. And if it is, then grab life by the horns, do what you got to do, follow through. ASH has so many resources for you. You can be successful. If you put your mind to it, really put in the work, you will be successful. You just have to find the right mentors, work with your mentors, and follow through, and you will be successful. And I think that's really important, but make sure it's what you want to do. That I can't stress enough. And Hanny, I really, really appreciate you coming today and talking with us about all this.
No, it's my pleasure. I couldn't agree more. I always say it's way better to do something you love 80 hours a week than to do something that you don't 30 hours a week. You kind of figure out, and you will figure out during your training, what really juices your engine. You'll figure out what gives you energy and what kind of saps it away. And if you love doing these things, you will have exposure to them during your residency fellowship, then it'll be very clear to you that this is the right path for you. But go in with an open mind, seek out the exposures so you know this is for me or no, this is not for me. I totally agree.
All right. That'll conclude another episode of our joint podcast, The Fellow on Call and the Trainee Council. We'll see everybody next time.
This podcast was edited by Resonate Recordings.